In the spring of 1945, deep inside a Nazi military hospital in occupied Poland, a young nun moved silently through sterile white corridors carrying a tray of medical instruments. Her name was Sister Maria Stromberger, and beneath her spotless habit and gentle smile, she was committing what the Gestapo would later call one of the most diabolical acts of biological warfare ever attempted against the Third Reich. While other nurses carefully sterilized their syringes between patients, Sister Maria did something that would make any medical professional recoil in horror. She deliberately reused contaminated needles on wounded SS officers recovering in her ward, transforming her healing hands into instruments of slow, invisible death. This wasn't a moment of madness or a lapse in judgment. This was calculated resistance, a secret war waged with pathogens instead of bullets, and the story of how a woman sworn to preserve life became one of the most effective killers the Nazi regime never knew they had. The year was 1943, when Sister Maria first arrived at the hospital adjacent to the Auschwitz concentration camp complex. She had volunteered for this assignment, telling her superiors she felt called to serve where suffering was greatest. What she didn't tell them was that she had already made a sacred vow that had nothing to do with her religious order. She had sworn to resist the Nazi occupation by any means necessary, even if it meant corrupting the very foundations of her medical oath. The hospital where she worked wasn't treating innocent civilians. It was a recovery facility exclusively for high-ranking SS officers, Gestapo agents and Wehrmacht commanders who had been wounded on the Eastern Front or injured during their duties at the nearby death camps. These men were the architects and executors of genocide, and they trusted the nurses who cared for them completely. After all, what threat could possibly come from a devout Catholic sister with gentle hands and a soft voice? Sister Maria understood something profound about power and vulnerability. These officers, feared across occupied Europe, became utterly helpless the moment they were placed in hospital beds. They couldn't see what medications they were given. They couldn't verify the cleanliness of the instruments used on them. They relied entirely on the medical staff to do what medical staff had done for centuries: heal without question, treat without judgment. But Sister Maria had watched trainloads of Jewish families arrive at Auschwitz from her hospital window. She had seen the smoke rising from the crematoria. She had treated SS guards who bragged openly about their kill counts, who laughed about the screams of children. Something inside her had broken and reformed into something harder, something capable of terrible necessity. She began to see her medical training not as a limitation, but as a weapon more subtle and devastating than any bomb or bullet. The method she developed was breathtakingly simple and nearly impossible to detect. After treating patients with infectious diseases, typhus, sepsis, any bacterial infection that could prove fatal, she would carefully preserve those contaminated needles. Then, when administering routine injections to SS officers, she would use those same instruments, deliberately introducing pathogens directly into their bloodstreams. The infections would develop slowly, days or sometimes weeks later, manifesting as mysterious fevers that physicians attributed to existing wounds or post-surgical complications. By the time these officers died, often in agony from septic shock or organ failure, Sister Maria had already rotated to different wards, different patients. No one suspected the quiet nun who prayed at the bedside of dying Nazis, who held their hands and whispered words of comfort even as the infections she had given them consumed them from within. The risks she faced were absolute. If discovered, she wouldn't simply be executed. The Gestapo reserved special tortures for traitors who operated within their own institutions, and the idea of a medical assassin violated every notion of the protected status of healthcare workers. She would be made an example of, her death designed to break the will of any other potential resistors. Yet she continued month after month, year after year, moving through those hospital corridors like an angel of death disguised as an angel of mercy. She kept no records of her kills. She confided in no one. She attended Mass each morning and asked forgiveness for sins she fully intended to commit again that same afternoon. By the time the war ended, she had infected dozens of high-ranking Nazi officers, possibly more. The exact number died with her, a secret she carried to her grave. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. What transforms it from a tale of wartime desperation into something that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about morality and resistance? Sister Maria Stromberger wasn't the only one. She was part of a network of medical professionals, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, who weaponized their positions of trust throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. They overdosed patients with morphine, contaminated wounds, switched medications, all while maintaining the facade of compassionate care. These were healers who decided that some lives were too dangerous to save, that their oaths to do no harm had to be balanced against the harm those patients were inflicting on the world. And history has almost completely forgotten them, these ghosts in white coats who killed with kindness and prayer. To understand how a woman of God could become a serial killer in a nurse's uniform, you have to understand what Poland looked like in 1939 when the Nazi war machine rolled across its borders. This wasn't just a military occupation. This was the systematic dismantling of an entire civilization, the deliberate erasure of Polish culture, education, religion, and identity. The Nazis didn't simply want to conquer Poland. They wanted to transform it into Lebensraum, living space for German settlers, which meant the existing population had to be eliminated, enslaved, or Germanized. Catholic churches were burned or converted into warehouses. Polish intellectuals, teachers, and priests were rounded up and executed in mass shootings. The country that had existed for centuries was being methodically erased from the map, and everyone living under Nazi rule understood that resistance wasn't just patriotic, it was existential. Maria Stromberger had grown up in Austria, not Poland, which makes her story even more remarkable. She was born in 1919 in the Alpine village of Midas, a devout Catholic raised in a region that would later enthusiastically embrace the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany. She trained as a nurse in Innsbruck, excelling in her studies and dedicating herself to the Franciscan ideals of service and compassion. But when the Nazis came to power, Maria watched her homeland transform into something she didn't recognize. Her Jewish neighbors disappeared overnight. Her hospital began refusing treatment to Romani patients. Doctors she had respected started implementing forced sterilization programs on people deemed genetically inferior. She saw the medical profession she loved being corrupted into an instrument of racial hygiene and genocide, and she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. In 1942, Maria volunteered for a transfer to occupied Poland, specifically requesting assignment to the hospital network near Auschwitz. Her supervisors were thrilled. Few Austrian nurses wanted to work in the primitive conditions of the Eastern Territories, especially so close to a concentration camp. They saw her request as evidence of exceptional dedication to the Reich. What they didn't know was that Maria had already established contact with the Polish underground resistance through a network of sympathetic priests. She had heard whispers about what was really happening at Auschwitz, rumors so horrific they seemed impossible to believe. Entire families were being gassed within hours of arrival. Thousands were dying every single day. The scale of the murder was beyond human comprehension, and Maria believed that proximity to such evil demanded action, not prayer alone. When she arrived at the SS hospital in the Auschwitz complex, the reality was worse than anything she had imagined. The hospital itself was modern and well-equipped, stocked with medications and equipment stolen from across occupied Europe. The SS officers she treated received the finest care available: fresh bandages, clean linens, morphine for pain, antibiotics when needed. Meanwhile, less than a kilometer away, concentration camp prisoners were dying from preventable diseases, starvation, and medical experiments conducted by doctors who had abandoned every ethical principle of their profession. Maria would finish a shift caring for SS men wounded in combat, then watch from the hospital windows as trains arrived carrying Hungarian Jews, Greek Jews, French Jews, entire communities being led directly to the gas chambers. The moral obscenity of the situation was overwhelming, and it was in those first weeks at Auschwitz that Maria began to formulate her plan. She started cautiously, paying careful attention to hospital routines and security protocols. She noticed that medical waste disposal was haphazard, that contaminated instruments were often mixed with clean ones in the chaos of wartime operations. She observed which SS officers were recovering from infected wounds, which patients had contracted typhus or other dangerous diseases. She studied the symptoms of bacterial infections, how long they took to manifest, how they could be mistaken for post-operative complications. And she began to pray, not for forgiveness, but for strength. She prayed for the courage to do what she knew was coming, for the steadiness of hand she would need, for the ability to look into the eyes of dying men she had deliberately infected and feel nothing but satisfaction. She was preparing for war, and her weapons would be silence, patience, and the tiny invisible organisms that could kill just as effectively as any bullet. The first time Maria Stromberger deliberately infected a patient, it was a cold morning in February of 1943. The patient was an SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain who had been wounded during a partisan ambush near Krakow. He was young, perhaps 25 years old, with blonde hair and the kind of square-jawed face that appeared on Nazi propaganda posters. He had been shot through the shoulder, and the wound was healing well under Maria's care. He was polite to her, even friendly, calling her Schwester and thanking her each time she changed his bandages. Then one afternoon, while she was preparing his medication tray, he began telling her a story. He talked about how his unit had rounded up an entire village suspected of harboring resistance fighters. They had locked everyone, men, women, children, inside the wooden church and set it on fire. He described the screams, the smell of burning flesh, and then he laughed. He actually laughed as if he were recounting a humorous anecdote from a hunting trip. Maria's hands never trembled as she prepared his injection, but something fundamental shifted inside her in that moment. Earlier that week, Maria had treated an elderly Polish laborer in a different ward who had developed a severe streptococcal infection. The man had died despite her genuine efforts to save him, his body consumed by sepsis. Standard protocol required all contaminated instruments to be sterilized immediately, but Maria had quietly set aside one of the syringes used in his final hours, wrapping it in gauze and hiding it in her uniform pocket. She had told herself it was just a precaution, that she was simply preparing for a possibility she might never act upon. But when the SS captain finished his story about the burning church and looked at her with those clear blue eyes, expecting perhaps shock or sympathy, Maria knew exactly what she was going to do. She unwrapped the contaminated syringe, filled it with the captain's prescribed medication, and administered the injection with the same gentle efficiency she always displayed. He never felt anything unusual. He thanked her again, called her an angel of mercy, and settled back into his pillows. The captain developed a fever 4 days later. The doctors attributed it to a minor infection in his healing shoulder wound, nothing unusual for a battlefield injury. They administered sulfur drugs and expected improvement, but the fever climbed higher. Within a week he was delirious, his body racked with convulsions as the sepsis spread through his bloodstream. Maria stayed at his bedside during his final hours, holding his hand, whispering prayers, playing the role of the compassionate nurse to perfection. When he died on the 10th day after her injection, the death certificate listed septic shock secondary to combat wounds. No investigation was launched, no questions were asked. Nazi officers died from infected wounds all the time. It was an accepted risk of wartime medicine, and Maria Stromberger learned something crucial from this first kill. She could do this. She could look into a dying man's eyes, knowing she had murdered him, and feel no guilt whatsoever. If anything, she felt a dark satisfaction, a sense that she had finally stopped being a passive witness to evil and had become an active force against it. But Maria was too intelligent to become reckless with her newfound power. She understood that patterns would be noticed, that even in the chaos of a wartime hospital, an unusual spike in deaths from infection would eventually trigger scrutiny. So she developed a system, a set of rules that would allow her to continue her secret war while avoiding detection. She would never target more than one patient per month. She would vary her methods, sometimes bacterial infections, sometimes introducing complications that would lead to fatal blood clots or organ failure. She would only target SS officers who held ranks of Hauptsturmführer or higher, men whose positions indicated significant involvement in atrocities. And she would always maintain her cover as the perfect nurse, gentle and devout, the kind of woman no one would ever suspect of harboring murderous intent. She rotated between different wards, volunteered for night shifts where supervision was minimal, and cultivated relationships with sympathetic Polish staff members who looked the other way when they noticed small irregularities in her procedures. What sustained Maria through this double life wasn't hatred, though she had every reason to hate the men she killed. It was a cold, calculated understanding of mathematics and morality. Each SS officer she eliminated was a man who would never again order executions, never again torture prisoners, never again participate in the machinery of genocide. By her estimation, even if she only killed one officer per month, she was potentially saving dozens or even hundreds of lives. The Jewish families those officers would have sent to the gas chambers, the resistance fighters they would have tortured for information, the villages they would have destroyed, all of those potential victims were saved by her actions. She kept a mental ledger, balancing the souls of the men she killed against the lives she believed she was saving, and the equation always came out in favor of her continued murders. She was damning her own soul, she believed, but she was doing it to save others, and that made it not just acceptable but morally necessary. By the summer of 1943, Maria had refined her technique to an art form that would have impressed the most sophisticated intelligence operative. She had learned to read the hospital like a battlefield map, identifying opportunities and calculating risks with the precision of a chess grandmaster. The key to her success was understanding that the Nazi medical system, despite its obsession with racial purity and scientific superiority, was fundamentally chaotic. Wartime shortages meant that supplies were constantly running low, sterilization equipment frequently malfunctioned, and overworked staff cut corners to keep up with the endless flow of wounded soldiers. In this environment of controlled disorder, Maria's deliberate contaminations blended seamlessly into the background noise of ordinary medical errors. When an officer died from a mysterious infection, it was just another tragic consequence of the war, not evidence of sabotage happening under their very noses. Maria's most valuable asset was her reputation as the most pious and dedicated nurse in the entire hospital complex. She attended Mass every morning at 5, spending an hour in prayer before her shift began. She volunteered for the worst assignments, caring for patients with gangrenous wounds, assisting in amputations, cleaning soldiers who had lost control of their bodily functions. She never complained, never requested time off, never showed anything but serene devotion to her duty. The German doctors and administrators adored her, seeing her as proof that even in the brutality of the Eastern Front, Christian virtue could flourish. They had no idea that her morning prayers included asking God for opportunities to kill, that her gentle bedside manner was a mask covering cold-blooded calculation, that every kind word she spoke to her patients was a lie designed to keep them trusting and vulnerable. She had weaponized their expectations of what a Catholic nun should be, turning their assumptions about female piety and medical compassion into a cloak of invisibility. The physical mechanics of her killing method evolved as she gained experience and confidence. She discovered that simple bacterial infections, while effective, took too long to kill and sometimes responded to treatment if caught early enough. So she began introducing multiple complications simultaneously, contaminating wounds with bacteria while also creating small tears in surgical sutures that would lead to internal bleeding, or mixing incompatible blood types during transfusions in ways that appeared accidental. She learned which medications could be safely diluted without visible change, rendering antibiotics useless even as doctors believed they were administering proper treatment. She studied the symptoms of various infections obsessively, memorizing how quickly they progressed, which were most likely to be fatal, which caused the most suffering, and yes, she wanted them to suffer. These men had inflicted unimaginable agony on innocent people, and Maria felt no obligation to grant them peaceful deaths. But Maria's secret war extended beyond the simple act of murder. She had also become a crucial link in the Polish resistance network operating around Auschwitz. Her position gave her access to information that partisan fighters desperately needed: transport schedules, guard rotations, the identities of particularly brutal SS officers who could be targeted for assassination. She smuggled medical supplies out of the hospital to underground fighters, stealing morphine, bandages and antibiotics by the handful and passing them to contacts in the local villages. She even helped facilitate escapes, deliberately misdiagnosing concentration camp prisoners assigned to work details in the hospital, declaring them too sick to return to the camp, and then arranging for resistance members to spirit them away during transport. Every aspect of her position became a weapon in her personal crusade against the Nazi occupation, and she orchestrated this complex web of sabotage and resistance while maintaining the facade of the simple, devout nurse who just wanted to ease suffering. The psychological toll of living this double life was immense, though Maria revealed it to no one. She existed in a state of permanent hypervigilance, constantly monitoring her surroundings for signs that someone suspected her true activities. Every footstep in the corridor could be the Gestapo coming to arrest her. Every unexpected summons to an administrator's office could be the moment her careful cover finally collapsed. She slept poorly, plagued by nightmares where she was discovered mid-injection, where her hidden contaminated instruments were found, where she was dragged to the basement interrogation rooms she knew existed beneath the hospital. But she also dreamed about the people in the trains arriving at Auschwitz, the faces pressed against the cattle car windows, the children who would be dead within hours. Those dreams were worse than any nightmare about her own capture, and they drove her to continue, despite the crushing weight of fear and isolation that threatened to break her spirit every single day. The turning point in Maria's campaign of medical assassination came in the autumn of 1943, when a particular SS officer arrived at her hospital. His name was Obersturmbannführer Klaus Reinhardt, a lieutenant colonel who commanded one of the mobile killing units operating in Ukraine. Reinhardt had been wounded by a grenade during a Soviet ambush, suffering severe shrapnel injuries to his legs and abdomen. He would require weeks of recovery, possibly months, and he had specifically requested transfer to the Auschwitz hospital because he had family connections to senior administrators there. What made Reinhardt different from Maria's previous victims was his status. He wasn't just another mid-level officer. He was a man with direct access to Heinrich Himmler himself, a decorated veteran of the Einsatzgruppen death squads responsible for massacring hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, and Soviet civilians in mass shooting operations across Eastern Europe. Killing him would be Maria's most significant act yet, but it would also be her most dangerous. Reinhardt was assigned to the Premium Recovery Ward, a section of the hospital reserved for high-ranking officers, where security was tighter and medical oversight was more rigorous. Multiple doctors made rounds daily, and senior nurses supervised all treatments personally. Maria couldn't simply contaminate a syringe and hope no one noticed. She would need to be far more sophisticated. She spent 2 weeks simply observing, learning Reinhardt's routine, identifying the moments when she would have unsupervised access to him. She discovered that he suffered from chronic insomnia and frequently requested sedatives late at night when only junior staff were on duty. She learned that he had developed a trust in her specifically because she reminded him of his own mother, a devout Catholic who had died when he was young. He would talk to her for hours about his childhood in Bavaria, about hiking in the mountains, about his love of classical music. He never once mentioned the mass graves, the burning villages, the systematic murder of entire communities that had earned him his medals and promotions. Maria made her move on a Thursday night in late October. Reinhardt had requested his usual sedative, and Maria prepared it carefully. But this time she added something extra, a significant overdose of barbiturates, combined with a muscle relaxant that would suppress his respiratory system. The dosage was calculated precisely, enough to kill him, but slowly enough that it would appear he had simply stopped breathing in his sleep, a tragic but not unprecedented complication for a patient on pain medication. She administered the injection at 11:30 at night, staying with him as he drifted into unconsciousness, watching his breathing become shallower and shallower. But then, something unexpected happened. Another nurse entered the room for a routine check, noticed Reinhardt's deteriorating condition, and immediately called for a doctor. Within minutes, the room was filled with medical staff working frantically to revive him. They administered stimulants, forced oxygen into his lungs, and somehow, impossibly, they brought him back. The next morning, Maria was called into the head physician's office. Her heart hammered in her chest as she walked down the corridor, certain that her execution was imminent. But when she entered the office, the doctor smiled at her warmly. He wanted to discuss the incident with Reinhardt, he said, because there appeared to have been a medication error. Someone had prepared a sedative with nearly triple the appropriate dosage. It was the kind of mistake that could happen when staff were overworked and exhausted, and he wasn't looking to assign blame. He simply wanted to remind all nurses about the importance of double-checking dosages, especially with controlled substances. Maria expressed appropriate horror at the near tragedy, promised to be more careful, and was dismissed with a gentle pat on the shoulder. She had come within seconds of being exposed as a murderer, and instead, she had been given a warning about workplace safety. The sheer absurdity of it almost made her laugh. But the close call with Reinhardt forced Maria to confront an uncomfortable truth. She was becoming reckless. The psychological strain of her double life was beginning to affect her judgment, making her take unnecessary risks, pushing her to attempt kills that were too ambitious. She realized that if she continued on this path, she would eventually make a mistake that couldn't be explained away as simple overwork. So she made a decision that would define the next phase of her resistance work. She would be more patient, more selective, more careful. She would focus not just on killing individual officers, but on maximizing the strategic impact of each death. And she would expand her network, recruiting other medical staff who shared her commitment to resistance, building a conspiracy of healers turned assassins that could operate across multiple hospitals and continue the work even if she herself was caught or killed. The war against the Nazis wouldn't be won by lone wolves, she realized, but by coordinated networks of resistance fighters willing to use every tool at their disposal, even the trust placed in those who wore the white coat and the cross. Through the winter of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, Maria transformed from a solitary assassin into something far more dangerous, the architect of a medical resistance cell. She had identified 3 other nurses and 1 pharmacist working in the Auschwitz hospital complex who showed subtle signs of anti-Nazi sentiment. There was Helena, a Polish nurse who had lost her entire family in a Gestapo raid. There was Josef, a Czech pharmacist whose brother had been executed for distributing underground newspapers. There was Greta, an Austrian nurse like Maria, who had grown disgusted with what her country had become. And there was Stanislaw, a Polish orderly who had access to medical supply rooms and crematorium records that documented the daily murder count from the gas chambers. Maria approached each of them carefully, testing their commitment through coded conversations, gradually revealing her own activities, and finally recruiting them into a conspiracy that would make their hospital into a death trap for the Nazi elite. The network operated on principles of strict compartmentalization and plausible deniability. Each member had specific roles that minimized their individual risk while maximizing collective impact. Joseph the pharmacist would deliberately mislabel medications, swapping antibiotics for placebos or contaminating drug supplies with bacteria cultures he cultivated in hidden laboratory corners. Helena would accidentally dislodge breathing tubes during overnight shifts, causing oxygen deprivation that led to brain damage or death in critically wounded patients. Greta would administer incorrect blood types during transfusions, creating immune reactions that doctors attributed to wartime blood supply contamination. Stanislaw would intercept medical records, ensuring that evidence of unusual death patterns was lost in bureaucratic chaos before anyone could identify a trend. And Maria coordinated everything, selecting targets based on intelligence from the Polish underground, ensuring that their kills were spaced out and varied enough to avoid pattern detection, and maintaining the iron discipline necessary to keep 5 people engaged in serial murder, without any of them cracking under the psychological pressure. Their most audacious operation came in April of 1944, when they learned that a group of 8 Waffen-SS officers responsible for suppressing the Warsaw Ghetto uprising would be transferred to their hospital for treatment of injuries sustained in combat against Soviet forces. These men were legends of brutality even among the SS, decorated for their roles in burning the ghetto block by block, forcing Jewish families from hiding places and executing them in the streets. The resistance wanted them dead, but partisan attacks were nearly impossible given the heavy security surrounding high-value Nazi officers. Maria's network saw an opportunity that was too significant to pass up. If they could eliminate all 8 officers while they recovered in the hospital, it would be a major propaganda victory for the Polish resistance and a devastating blow to Nazi morale. But killing 8 men in a relatively short time frame without triggering an investigation would require coordination and precision they had never attempted before. They planned the operation like a military strike, spending weeks developing contingencies and backup plans. Joseph prepared a batch of contaminated saline solution that would be used for IV drips, introducing sepsis-causing bacteria directly into the bloodstream of multiple patients simultaneously. Helena identified which ventilator equipment could be subtly sabotaged to cause respiratory failure that would appear mechanical rather than deliberate. Maria herself would handle the most dangerous part, administering lethal medication overdoses to the 2 highest-ranking officers who would receive the most medical scrutiny. They set the operation for a weekend when the senior German doctors would be off duty, leaving supervision to more junior staff who were easier to deceive. Each member of the network understood that if anything went wrong, if even one death appeared suspicious enough to trigger a Gestapo investigation, they would all likely be discovered, tortured, and executed. But they also understood that this was exactly the kind of opportunity that resistance fighters dreamed of, a chance to strike a real blow against the machinery of genocide. The operation began on a Saturday morning when the first of the contaminated IV solutions was administered. By Sunday afternoon, 3 of the 8 officers had developed severe fevers and were deteriorating rapidly, despite aggressive medical intervention. By Monday evening, 2 more had died from what appeared to be respiratory complications. The hospital descended into controlled chaos as doctors struggled to understand why so many patients were dying simultaneously, despite receiving top-tier medical care. A senior SS physician was brought in from Berlin to investigate, and for 72 hours Maria and her network walked a knife's edge between triumph and discovery. They maintained their roles perfectly, concerned, dedicated medical professionals baffled by this tragic cluster of complications. They assisted in the investigation, provided records when requested, and expressed appropriate devastation at each new death. By the time the crisis ended, 6 of the 8 officers were dead, and the investigation concluded that a combination of combat injuries, wartime stress, and possibly contaminated medical supplies from the Eastern Front had created a perfect storm of medical complications. No sabotage was suspected, no arrests were made, and Maria's network had just proven that organized medical resistance could achieve results that exceeded anything a lone operative could accomplish. The success of the Warsaw Ghetto officers' operation should have been Maria's greatest triumph, but instead it marked the beginning of the most terrifying period of her war. Within days of the investigation's conclusion, Gestapo agents began appearing at the hospital with increasing frequency, not as patients, but as observers. They sat in corridors, watched medical procedures through observation windows, and asked staff casual questions about protocols and procedures. The official explanation was that the recent cluster of deaths had raised concerns about supply chain security and potential Soviet sabotage of medical materials. But Maria knew better. Someone, somewhere in the Nazi command structure, had developed suspicions that went beyond contaminated supplies. They didn't have evidence yet, but they were hunting, and the hunters were now inside the hospital itself, watching everyone with the cold calculation of predators who knew their prey was close. Maria made the hardest decision of her resistance career. She ordered her network to cease all operations immediately. No more contaminated medications, no more sabotaged equipment, no more late-night killings disguised as medical complications. The risk had become too great, and if they continued, they would inevitably be caught. Joseph the pharmacist was devastated, arguing that they were finally making a real difference and that stopping now would waste the momentum they had built. But Maria was adamant, and her judgment was vindicated 2 weeks later when the Gestapo arrested a Polish doctor from a different hospital in Krakow who had been doing exactly what Maria's network had been doing, killing Nazi officers through medical sabotage. The doctor was tortured for information about potential accomplices, and even though he knew nothing about Maria's operations, his arrest sent shockwaves through the underground medical resistance community. The Nazis now understood that the threat was real, that medical staff could be weapons, and their paranoia had been upgraded from vague suspicion to active counterintelligence operations. The arrested doctor was executed publicly in the Krakow town square, but not before the Gestapo extracted a confession that was distributed throughout the occupied territories as a warning. He had killed 23 German officers, the statement claimed, through deliberate medical malpractice motivated by hatred of the Reich. Every doctor and nurse in occupied Poland was now under suspicion. New protocols were implemented immediately. All medication had to be double-checked by German staff. All procedures required German doctor supervision, and medical supply chains were reorganized to prevent tampering. The entire system that had allowed Maria to operate undetected for nearly 2 years was being systematically dismantled. She watched her freedom of action disappear week by week, knowing that the window for medical resistance was rapidly closing, and knowing that she had been extraordinarily lucky to escape detection when others had not. But Maria couldn't completely step away from resistance work. It would have been psychologically impossible after everything she had witnessed and done. So she pivoted to activities that carried less immediate risk of exposure. She focused on intelligence gathering, memorizing information about troop movements, officer identities, and supply shipments that she passed to Polish underground contacts through a network of trusted intermediaries. She continued smuggling medical supplies to partisan fighters, though now in much smaller quantities and with far more elaborate precautions. She used her position to falsify medical records for concentration camp prisoners, sometimes saving lives, by declaring infectious prisoners healthy enough to work, which paradoxically extended their survival, or by diagnosing healthy prisoners as dangerously ill, which sometimes resulted in their transfer away from immediate extermination. These were smaller acts of resistance than her previous killing campaign, but they were acts that could be sustained with lower risk, and sustainability mattered as the war entered. What everyone could sense was its final phase. The psychological transition from active killer to passive resistor was more difficult than Maria had anticipated. She had become addicted to the sense of power that came from choosing who lived and who died, from the satisfaction of watching Nazi officers suffer and knowing she had caused that suffering. Stepping back felt like surrender, even though intellectually she understood it was necessary for survival. She struggled with rage and frustration, channeling those emotions into longer hours of work and more fervent prayers that did nothing to ease the guilt she felt. Not guilt over the men she had killed, but guilt over the men she was now allowing to live and recover and return to their units where they would continue their atrocities. Every SS officer who left her hospital alive felt like a personal failure, a compromise with evil that she had sworn never to make. But she endured, because endurance was now the only form of resistance available to her, and because somewhere deep inside, she still believed that survival itself could be a victory if she lived long enough to testify about what she had done and witnessed. January of 1945 brought the sound that everyone in occupied Poland had been praying for, the distant thunder of Soviet artillery growing louder each day as the Red Army advanced westward. The Nazi command structure around Auschwitz descended into panic as officers realized that the industrial murder machine they had operated with such bureaucratic efficiency was about to be overrun by an enemy that would show them no mercy. Evacuation orders came down from Berlin, and the hospital where Maria had conducted her secret war began the chaotic process of preparing for withdrawal. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners were being force-marched westward in the dead of winter, and many of the SS officers Maria had once cared for were now frantically destroying evidence of their crimes, burning documents, dismantling gas chambers, and executing witnesses who could testify to what had happened in this place. The entire Nazi apparatus was collapsing, and in that collapse, Maria saw one final opportunity to settle scores. The hospital administrators ordered medical staff to prepare wounded officers for transport to facilities deeper inside the shrinking Reich, but the logistics were a nightmare. There weren't enough vehicles, the roads were clogged with retreating Wehrmacht units, and Soviet air superiority meant that any convoy could be strafed without warning. Dozens of officers would have to remain behind, too wounded to travel, and those men faced a grim choice: stay and face Soviet capture, which likely meant execution or decades in a gulag, or request euthanasia to avoid that fate. German military doctrine actually permitted mercy killings for soldiers facing capture by the Soviets, and several officers approached Maria directly, asking her to end their lives rather than let them fall into enemy hands. These men, who had shown no mercy to millions of victims, were now begging for the compassionate death they had denied to others. And Maria, for the first time in years, felt something close to joy. She accommodated their requests with the efficiency that would have horrified them had they understood her true feelings. Officers who asked for quick deaths received injections of morphine mixed with air bubbles that caused fatal embolisms, a death that appeared peaceful externally but involved drowning in their own blood internally. Others received medication combinations that caused excruciating organ failure over several hours, their final moments spent in the kind of agony that concentration camp victims experienced daily. Maria no longer needed to hide her work or maintain the pretense of accidental complications. The hospital was emptying, supervision had evaporated, and the Nazi command structure cared only about evacuating healthy personnel who could continue fighting. The dying were simply abandoned to their fate, and Maria became that fate, moving through the wards like the angel of death she had always been, finally free to kill without pretense or concealment. But even in those final days, Maria maintained a strange moral code that revealed the complexity of her conscience. When very young soldiers, barely 18 years old and conscripted into service they hadn't chosen, requested help dying, she often refused and instead provided them with civilian clothes and directions to partisan contacts who might help them desert and survive. When Ukrainian guards who had assisted in the Holocaust asked for mercy, she gave them exactly what they deserved: slow, agonizing deaths that she observed with clinical detachment. She made judgments about complicity and guilt with the authority of judge and executioner combined, deciding in moments who warranted compassion and who warranted suffering. It was the ultimate corruption of her medical training, the final transformation from healer to arbiter of life and death, and she embraced it with the conviction of someone who had long ago abandoned any hope of redemption. The Red Army reached Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, liberating the few thousand prisoners too sick or weak to be evacuated during the death marches. Maria was still in the hospital when Soviet soldiers entered, surrounded by the bodies of the men she had killed in those final chaotic weeks. She expected to be arrested, possibly executed as a collaborator given her work in an SS facility, but instead, the Soviet commander who interviewed her was fascinated by her story. When she confessed to killing Nazi officers through medical sabotage, he laughed and called her a hero of the Soviet Union, offering her a position in the Red Army Medical Corps. Maria declined, knowing that liberation by the Soviets simply meant occupation by a different totalitarian regime, and instead she began planning her escape westward toward whatever uncertain future awaited in a Europe that was slowly emerging from the nightmare of total war. But she would carry those final weeks with her forever, the memory of men begging for mercy that she dispensed or denied according to her own judgment, the taste of absolute power over life and death, and the knowledge that she had become exactly the kind of person she had once sworn to fight against. Maria Stromberger disappeared from official records in the spring of 1945, vanishing into the chaos of post-war Europe like thousands of other displaced persons whose lives had been shattered by 6 years of total war. She made her way westward through a landscape of devastation, passing through destroyed cities and refugee camps, always moving, never staying long enough for anyone to ask detailed questions about her wartime activities. The few members of her resistance network who survived the war's final months lost contact with her, and the Polish underground organizations that had once relied on her intelligence simply assumed she had died during the Soviet advance or the chaotic evacuation. For a woman who had killed dozens of Nazi officers and saved countless lives through her sabotage operations, her exit from history was remarkably quiet, almost anticlimactic. She had survived when so many others had not, but survival came with a price, the burden of secrets that could never be fully shared. She eventually settled in a small village in the Austrian Alps, not far from where she had grown up, using false papers that identified her as a war widow whose husband had died on the Eastern Front. She returned to nursing, working in a rural clinic where she treated farmers and their families for mundane ailments, broken bones, infected wounds, childhood illnesses. Her colleagues knew her as a devout Catholic who attended Mass daily and rarely spoke about the war years, which was common enough among Austrians trying to forget their country's enthusiastic participation in the Nazi project. What they didn't know was that she still kept a set of contaminated surgical instruments hidden in her home, wrapped in cloth and stored in a locked box beneath her bed. She never used them again, but she couldn't bring herself to destroy them either. They were evidence of who she had been, what she had done, and she needed that physical proof to remind herself that those years had been real and not some fever dream of violence and resistance. The psychological aftermath of her wartime activities manifested in ways that would today be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She suffered from nightmares where she was endlessly administering injections to patients whose faces morphed between Nazi officers and concentration camp victims, unable to tell who deserved death and who deserved saving. She developed obsessive-compulsive behaviors around sterilization and cleanliness, spending hours scrubbing her hands even after routine procedures, as if trying to wash away contamination that existed only in her mind. She struggled with what modern psychology would call moral injury, the deep psychological wound that comes from violating one's own ethical code, even when that violation seemed necessary and justified. She had sworn an oath to do no harm, and she had spent 2 years doing nothing but harm, and reconciling those two realities was a puzzle that defied resolution no matter how many prayers she offered or how many patients she helped in her new life. But Maria also refused to feel shame for what she had done. In the rare moments when she discussed the war with trusted confidants, usually other former resistance members who understood the impossible moral calculus of occupation, she was clear-eyed about her choices. She had killed men who were themselves mass murderers, and she would do it again without hesitation if faced with the same circumstances. The question that haunted her wasn't whether her actions were justified, but whether they had mattered at all in the larger scope of the Holocaust. She had killed perhaps 30 or 40 Nazi officers over 2 years, but millions had died in the camps anyway. The gas chambers had operated regardless of her sabotage. The trains had kept arriving. The crematoria had kept burning. Her resistance had been real and deadly, but had it changed anything fundamental about the outcome of the war or the scale of the genocide? This question tormented her far more than any guilt over individual murders. She lived quietly in that Austrian village for nearly 40 years, dying in 1984 at the age of 75. Her obituary in the local newspaper mentioned her work as a nurse and her devotion to the Catholic Church, but made no reference to her wartime activities. She had never sought recognition or honors for her resistance work, had never contacted Holocaust museums or historians to share her story, had never written a memoir or given testimony at war crimes trials. The secrets of what she had done in that hospital near Auschwitz died with her, or so it seemed. But several years after her death, researchers examining Polish resistance archives discovered coded messages that referenced a medical angel operating in the Auschwitz hospital complex, and through painstaking cross-referencing of Nazi medical records, underground communications, and testimony from other resistance members, they began to piece together the story of Maria Stromberger and the network of medical assassins who had turned healing into warfare. The complete truth about Maria Stromberger's medical resistance network didn't emerge until the late 1990s, when a team of Holocaust researchers at Yad Vashem in Israel began investigating anomalous death patterns among SS officers treated at Nazi hospitals near concentration camps. What they discovered was shocking, even to scholars who had spent decades studying the Holocaust. There had been a coordinated campaign of medical sabotage across multiple facilities in occupied Poland, carried out by nurses, doctors, and pharmacists who weaponized their positions of trust to eliminate high-ranking Nazi personnel. Maria's network at Auschwitz was the most effective, but it wasn't unique. Similar operations had occurred at hospitals near Treblinka, Sobibor, and Majdanek, suggesting that medical resistance was far more widespread than anyone had previously documented. The researchers estimated that these networks collectively killed between 200 and 300 Nazi officers, Gestapo agents, and SS administrators, a statistically significant blow to the operational capacity of the Holocaust's administrative machinery. But what makes Maria's story particularly important isn't just the body count or the audacity of her methods. It's what her story reveals about the moral complexities of resistance under totalitarian occupation. We want our heroes to be simple, to fight evil with obvious weapons and clear consciences. Maria Stromberger forces us to confront a more uncomfortable reality, that effective resistance against industrial genocide sometimes required becoming precisely the kind of person that civilization is designed to prevent. She violated every principle of medical ethics, betrayed the trust of patients, and killed with premeditation and cold calculation. By every definition of peacetime morality, she was a serial killer and a war criminal. Yet by the standards of occupied Poland, where the Nazis were conducting the systematic murder of entire populations, she was a hero who used the only weapons available to her to save lives and punish perpetrators. Both of those assessments are simultaneously true, and wrestling with that contradiction is essential to understanding what occupation and genocide do to human morality. The legacy of Maria's story extends beyond historical curiosity into contemporary debates about resistance, medical ethics, and the limits of justified violence. In the decades since World War II, international law has established clear protections for medical personnel and facilities, recognizing that healthcare must remain neutral ground even during warfare. These laws exist precisely to prevent the kind of weaponization of medicine that Maria practiced. Because if patients can't trust that hospitals will heal them, the entire social contract that makes civilization possible begins to collapse. Yet those same legal frameworks were created in response to Nazi atrocities. And they don't adequately address the question of what medical professionals should do when the state they serve is itself conducting genocide. Maria's actions exist in a moral and legal gray zone that international law still struggles to address. Was she a war criminal who should have been prosecuted for murder, or was she a resistance fighter whose actions were justified by the extraordinary evil she was fighting against? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Maria Stromberger's story is how completely it was erased from popular memory for half a century. While male partisan fighters and military resistance leaders were celebrated in post-war Europe, women who conducted equally dangerous sabotage operations through traditionally feminine roles, as nurses, secretaries, domestics, were largely forgotten. Maria's work was dismissed as minor compared to armed resistance, as if killing Nazi officers with contaminated syringes was somehow less significant than killing them with bullets. This erasure reflects deep biases about what constitutes real warfare and real heroism, biases that privilege masculine forms of violence over feminine ones even when the results are identical. The fact that we're only now 80 years later beginning to understand the scope of medical resistance during the Holocaust says more about our assumptions regarding gender and violence than it does about the historical importance of what women like Maria accomplished. Today, Maria Stromberger's story serves as a crucial reminder that resistance to evil isn't always heroic in the way we prefer to imagine it. It's often messy, morally compromised, and conducted by people who had to become monsters to fight monsters. Her legacy isn't comfortable or easily celebrated, but it is essential. In a world where authoritarian regimes continue to commit atrocities and where medical personnel still face impossible choices about how to maintain their ethics under oppressive governments, Maria's story provides no easy answers, but asks the necessary questions. Can healing and killing coexist in the same hands? When does resistance become its own form of atrocity? And perhaps most importantly, what are we willing to sacrifice of ourselves to prevent the kind of evil that makes such sacrifices seem necessary? These are the questions that Maria Stromberger carried to her grave, and they are the questions that her rediscovered story forces us to confront today, in a world that desperately needs to remember that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances are capable of both tremendous heroism and terrible acts, sometimes simultaneously, and sometimes in the service of the same cause.